Hi, my name's Simon. I want to start by thanking EGA for putting on another awesome mushroom-related event. Really appreciate every event you guys run. Always a pleasure to be involved. Also start off by saying that this is a harm reduction presentation. I'm not condoning or encouraging any illegal activity, but it's important that if people are going to decide to ingest psychedelic mushrooms, they need to know how to do that in a safe way and minimize the harms that are possible. And I think it's important that we recognise that there are possible harms associated with the ingestion of psychedelic substances, and particularly with psychedelic mushrooms, given the risks around misidentification and the possible ingestion of toxic species, among some other factors like variability in potency between specimens and species, which we'll dive into a little bit here. This is going to be a really brief rundown of some basic harm reduction principles. I have given another talk about set and setting and optimizing the psychedelic experience to reduce the risks of a bad experience for EGA before, and you can find that on their YouTube channel. It's the summer mushroom season in the northern part of Australia at the moment, which means that there are Psilocybe cubensis and Panaeolus cyanescens, as well as some other less common species growing in dung in the warmer parts of the country. And they pop up after rain, and I think we've had lots of rain up on the northern parts of the east coast at the moment, so there are plenty around. When I think about approaching a psychedelic experience, I like to use a who, what, where, when, and how framework. So I'll run through that really quickly. Some of them I'll focus on a bit more than others. And again, I've talked about this in some more detail in another video. The who component is essentially thinking about who you should be taking these substances around and with. And, there's some obvious factors in that in terms of interpersonal conflicts and relationship issues that you might be having. But I want to talk specifically as well about the importance and recommendation to have a sober sitter with you, ideally in person, although some people do find it helpful even if they can just tee up a friend that they might be able to contact remotely or have touch base with them during the experience to make sure things are going okay. I think particularly when you're starting out and getting familiar with these substances, it's really important to have someone sober with you, ideally with you in person, and hopefully someone who's got a bit of experience with these substances themselves that can help, ground you a little bit if things start to go a little bit hairy. The other thing that I really wanted to touch base on here is the issue of consent. It is really difficult to consider and obtain consent for intimate contact while under the influence of these things. I think it's something that everyone needs to think about very closely and in a very considered way. And if some intimate contact is potentially going to be on the cards, it's really important to have a conversation about consent and how that's going to be approached during the experience beforehand, and again revisit it during, remembering that consent needs to be obtained at the time of the act, and that it can be revoked at any point during the act. You should never feel pressured to allow intimate contact that you're uncomfortable with, and also you should never take these substances around someone that you get a bad vibe from or think might take advantage of you, or in a position where you might be vulnerable, because unfortunately that sort of abuse does occur, and when it does, it's obviously extremely traumatizing, and it's never acceptable in any way at all. So please do keep those conversations front of mind and consider those things as well. The next important thing is what. So that is, what are you taking? It's really important, the species of mushroom that you are going to ingest, because the dosage does vary widely, species to species. It's also important in terms of Psilocybe cubensis, where it's been cultivated, to know something about which strain you're taking, because the lineage of strains that comes from the penis envy variety can be up to nearly double the strength of some of the other more common varieties of Psilocybe cubensis, which means that you might need, as little as half the dose as what you would normally be taking to get the same level of experience. So if you're using or purchasing or being given cultivated mushrooms, ask what the strain is as well, and do a bit of research on it before you dose that. The two common species that I mentioned before that do grow in this time of year in the warmer climates are Psilocybe cubensis and Panaeolus cyanescens. They come from two different genera. Generally speaking, Panaeolus cyanescens probably about double the potency of Psilocybe cubensis, and even more, relatively speaking, if you're consuming them fresh. Pancyans tend to lose a little bit more potency than cubes when they dry because of the mix of the alkaloids that's in them. But as a rule, you should be looking at least half the dose or so to start with, until you're familiar with that batch of that of that specimen. So the other thing there is then the difference in potency, one mushroom to the next. The two mushrooms growing next to each other in the field can still be quite different in potency, even if they are the same species. So the general harm reduction advice that's given is to prepare multiple doses at one time, either by drying multiple doses, powdering them and homogenizing the powder, and then starting at a low dose with that new batch of powder until you're familiar with the potency of that batch, or putting together a aqueous extract, a tea or a lemon tech with multiple doses, and then storing it safely, usually by freezing it in individual doses, and getting familiar with the potency of that tea. Again, always starting low and going slow. There's nothing heroic about overshooting the dose that you were going for or starting at a really, really high dose, particularly when you're starting out and you're unfamiliar with these substances. That's a pretty risky way to approach it in terms of having a bad experience and maybe going a bit deeper than you intended to, which can be pretty overwhelming, especially when you're not familiar with it or perhaps you're not in the right setting for that particular dose range. The other thing is food poisoning issues and contamination issues. Fungi are like any other food. They can and will go off if they're stored incorrectly or if you've picked them when they're past their use-by date. So if they smell funny, if they look moldy, if you've made a batch of tea and it's been sitting in the fridge for more than a couple of days, don't consume them. You certainly don't want to be dealing with food poisoning while you're in the midst of a psychedelic experience. That would be awful. So bear in mind those sorts of food safety approaches as well. Generally speaking, when people make an aqueous extract, they add some ascorbic acid to the mix, be that from citrus juice or from vitamin C tablets to prevent oxidation. When the tea is turning blue or the mushrooms are turning blue, it means that the product is oxidizing and the potency is being reduced, and some ascorbate can prevent that from happening. The next thing is where. Where are you going to take these things? It's important that you're comfortable. It's important that you're feeling safe. It's important that you've considered what responsibilities and distractions might pop up. If you have to go to work really early the next day, it's probably not the right time to dose mushrooms late at night. If you are the only person looking after your kids that night, it's probably pretty irresponsible to take psychedelic mushrooms and still have that responsibility there. Likewise, think about pets and just any other responsibility and distraction that might pop up, and factor those in and certainly plan around those in advance. You don't want surprises happening during the middle of the experience that mean that you suddenly have to deal with some sort of responsibility. Likewise, thinking about dosing these in the bush. If you are going to take these in the bush, you need to have someone sober with you who can drive for help if need be. Ideally, you'd be going somewhere where there is mobile phone reception, which is often a challenge in rural Australia, but it's good to have a bit of a backup emergency plan, and sometimes just having thought about that in advance makes it less likely that you're going to start freaking out about what might happen if something goes wrong once you're in the experience, somewhere remote or out in the bush. Thinking about when you might want to take on a psychedelic experience. A lot of people use these to deal with some sort of trauma or do some inner work or, get a different perspective on life or maybe evaluate where they're at and, where they want to go. With that said, if you're going to be approaching it with that sort of therapeutic intent, I think, more preparation is really important. And I think more consideration then needs to be given to the appropriate setting where that sort of work can be done. It may not be the sort of work that you want to do in a social setting at a party or something like that. And a lot of people just take them to have fun. And depending on your intention there, the dose that you're going to take, where you're going to take them, who you're going to take them around can all be a little bit different. So it's important to think about your intention and then factor that into the rest of these considerations as well. When you are looking to do some sort of internal therapeutic work, I think there is a slightly greater chance that things can get a little bit dark. And again, really important then to have someone experienced with you that you trust who can help work through any difficulties that might emerge, not necessarily by trying to do some therapy with you at the time, but just by trying to be able to ground you, distract you, bring you back into a happier place. Also then thinking about, making sure that you've got some food and some snacks and things like that around with you at the time, which probably fits better in where. With the how, some people do just eat the fresh mushrooms. Again, because of the difference in potency one specimen to another, I don't think that's the best approach from a safety perspective. And also the cellular structure of mushrooms made of chitin, which can be pretty hard for some people to digest and can increase the gastric upset that you might already experience just from the active chemicals themselves. So most people, I think, these days are preferencing to move towards making an aqueous extract, be that a tea or a lemon tea. When you have made an aqueous extract, the actives are going to be absorbed more rapidly because your body's not trying to get them out of the mushroom material itself first. And when it's absorbed more rapidly, it is going to reach a higher peak concentration for the same dose than it would if you were eating the mushrooms. And it is probably going to be a slightly shorter duration experience. So if you're making a tea, you might need a slightly lower dose than if you were planning to eat the mushrooms and eat the mushroom material, where your body would then have to pull the actives out a little bit. And it might be a slightly higher peak experience and a slightly shorter experience as well. Another really important harm and safety aspect is the legality. The TGA have rescheduled psilocybin to be used in supervised medical settings for treatment-resistant depression. That changed nothing in terms of personal possession at all. Still very much illegal. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear just how severe the penalties can be and the weight limits that are applied in a lot of the states. In many states in Australia, the weight limits for mushroom charges are actually based on weight limits that were intended to be applied to pure psilocybin, bearing in mind that dried mushrooms tend to be, maybe 1 to 2.5% psilocybin, depending on the species. You can imagine that the weight limits for pure psilocybin versus mushrooms are going to be vastly different. So as an example, in New South Wales, a commercial quantity is 25 grams. They don't care whether it's fresh or dry. And that has a potential maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. And usually for a commercial quantity, bail will be refused, which means you would often then find yourself in remand for the duration of the wait until the trial is heard. 100 grams is a large commercial quantity, which carries a maximum potential penalty of life imprisonment. Some states have different laws. The weight limits vary. The way that they consider mushrooms versus psilocybin can vary in some states. So check your local legislation, make sure they're familiar with it, and bear in mind that these mushrooms are still very much illegal, and the penalties can be really severe. For the Australian Psychedelic Society, we presented someone's story where they had been remanded to a maximum security prison for quite a few months, facing a commercial or a trafficable charge for, I think, about an ounce of mushrooms. So just bear that in mind. Penalties can be severe. And the other thing with these mushroom species that tend to be growing on farmland, where there are cattle and ruminants around, is that trespassing can actually carry some pretty serious penalties in and of itself, and attracts a lot of negative attention to the whole scene. So always get consent to enter someone's property first. Never trespass for the sake of getting some mushrooms. And the other reason why not to do that is from a biosecurity perspective. It's the same as if you were picking the cold weather species woodlovers in the forests, that you can track diseases and pathogens and seeds of weedy plants from one site to another if you're not adhering to biosecurity principles. So when you're going between sites to pick, you need to make sure that you sanitize your boots, remove any potential seeds, remove any potential spores and bacteria that might cause, foot rot or other transmissible livestock diseases and transmissible weedy species. So if you are going to be getting permission and entering someone's property, please make sure that you've also adhered to those biosecurity principles as well. I know that's a lot of really serious stuff, and I think it's still really important to think about these things in advance. If you have a good plan, if you've thought things through clearly, it is much less likely that you're going to have a difficult experience, and it's much less likely that something seriously bad can happen during the experience because you've approached it in a prepared and deliberate way. And I think for a lot of people, just knowing that you've thought about it clearly lessens the chance that the experience gets tainted by a lot of anxiety that might come up if all of a sudden, while you're entering the psychedelic space, you start to freak out about, hey, what are we going to do if someone trips over and breaks an ankle out here? Or, what are we going to do if, one of us gets into a really difficult psychedelic experience out here in this isolated place? Or what am I going to do now that I've started freaking out and I'm alone and no one knows that, that I'm doing this today? Who do I call? So having all of those things figured out in advance, I think, actually reduces the chance that things go bad in the first place, and certainly makes that everyone's more likely to be safe and enjoy their experience and get the most out of it. So, yeah, thanks again, EGA. Really brief harm reduction rundown, and please check out the videos on the Australian Psychedelic Society YouTube as well. For ID resources, EGA have a lot of really great ones, and there's some awesome Facebook groups as well. I work with the PMANZ team on Facebook, PMANZ. There's another Australian Psilocybe identification group called PIMP. Really worth joining those groups, especially when you're trying to figure out how to ID these mushrooms, which is really super important, and double check your IDs with someone who already knows what they're talking about while you're still learning. Thank you.
For Simon now, would you recommend combining B-carpy with psilocybin for a mushroom journey, with the acknowledgement and dose adjustments taken into consideration? Psychedelically aware asking that question.
I'm not going to recommend anybody take mushrooms for anything ever, but I think the thing to remember is that the B-cap is going to have some monoamine oxidase inhibitors in it that's going to potentially potentiate the psilocybin effects. It inhibits one of the breakdown pathways for that, and it has its own, the harmalas that are in the cappy vine have their own biological effects as well. Some people find them quite interesting just on their own. So I'd just say combinations are best left to people with some experience with both of the things that they're planning to combine together to change an experience, and to do some research and look at. There's plenty of reports and stuff like this from online that you can find where people have combined all sorts of different things on like Erowid and other forums. So suss out what other people have experienced as well in advance. And if you are going to combine two different things together, especially if there's a possibility that they will potentiate them, you need to start extra slow with low doses of both of the both of the things you're going to combine, and work your way up while you're getting more familiar with them.
Might be a good point here to also point people to the EGA entheogenic combination matrix, which is a resource available there on the EGA website, and has had some recent updates with some more detailed information about what to expect from certain combinations, because first and foremost, there is still a prohibition in play. You are putting yourself at legal risk by taking prohibited substances, but that taken into consideration, the various different effects of chemicals can change in combination, and if you are thinking of doing anything like that, then do try and find some information about any kind of interactions between those things. Okay, this one's for Simon. Simon, due to the increased strength of the lemon tech method, do you think it's a good idea, good side method for the first time users over the more traditional powdered mushrooms?
I think, like in my little talk, I was saying the better way to approach any new method that you're going to ingest mushroom by is to get familiar with the batch that you've got in front of you, and to always start low and go slow. So if there's a particular dose range you're going to be aiming for, and you're not too sure what the potency of your batch of mushrooms or mushroom tea in front of you is, shoot under. You can always take a little bit more, even though that doesn't necessarily sort of amplify the experience of mushrooms, within much of a window of the first dose. But it's still better to undershoot than overshoot, and you can always come back and try it again later. But if you've made up multiple doses into a single batch, just start lower, and with the lemon tech, or even just any other sort of aqueous extract, if you start a little bit lower than you might when you're eating the mushrooms, especially until you're familiar with the different methods, it's going to be the safest way to go.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate that start low, go slow is pretty good advice generally for most things, because it's much harder to get out of something that you've thrown yourself into the deep end of than getting out of the kiddie pool. This one is for Simon. Are there any rumours, talk of law reform now that it has medical status? Who has the authority to produce them for medical purposes from Cosmic Kaleidoscope? I also might be able to chime in on that, but Simon.
Yeah, look, in terms of the second half of the question, Alistair probably seems like he's in a better position to answer it than me now. I wouldn't have a clue. I think last I heard, we were still planning to be importing most of the psilocybin that was going to be used clinically at the moment, that I don't think any doses have been administered clinically in Australia yet. Could be wrong on that. It's changing really quickly, but don't think we're actually at that point just yet with the psilocybin. And in terms of law reform, unfortunately, I think what Canberra, New South Wales and Queensland probably now feel like they've done enough with the fairly minimal changes they have made to some of their drug laws. New South Wales is still planning to have a drugs summit, which seems like an political move to me, given that they had the ICE inquiry with a pretty comprehensive amount of evidence provided to them from health experts and community groups and everybody who has some knowledge about this and should be heard on the subject. And none of those recommendations have been implemented yet. So I'm not expecting it to happen anytime in the near future, but I think there are changes in the works and things are moving and stigma is dropping and more people are using these things and more benefits being shown and less harms being sort of demonstrated. It's getting harder and harder to push the existing narrative around particularly psychedelics and, you know, to some extent some other drugs as well, and also just more broadly pushing the narrative that the drug laws are effective or helpful in any way is becoming a harder sell, I think. So yeah, fingers crossed and hopefully, but I think the best way to do it is to get involved in public advocacy and write to your local members of parliament and your federal government and let them know that you want to see these things change, because until it's a politically safe thing to do, there's not really any reason to do it. You know, there's still talking about a fairly small demographic of the population at the moment who are interested in these things. It is not really a big voting issue, and because of the laws and their very nature, I think it's a silent minority as well, and the more noise that gets made, the more likely it is to shift.
Yeah, and much of that is reflected in Victoria as well, where we had an inquiry, a wide-ranging inquiry that had 50 recommendations. I think a small number of them have been partly applied here in Victoria, but it has moved very slow. Even the fact that people who are prescribed cannabis can still, regardless of the fact that they're not impaired driving, they will still test positive on that on those devices. And as the law stands, that's all that's required to charge somebody. It's not about impairment, and it's not about whether or not you have a prescription, which seems particularly absurd. So there's probably smaller fish to fry at the moment. But that said, there are only a small handful of people every year here in Victoria. I'm not sure about other states, but I would say that it's pretty similar, maybe with the exception of WA, when that little pocket of community, I can't remember, Ballingsworth, or I'll have to go and look it up later. That got a lot of police attention, but generally there's less than a dozen people who are charged with psilocybin-based offences in any given year. It's a small number, and it's on the books, so it is possible. And for those that it does happen to, it can be devastating. So we want to absolutely get rid of it, but it's not something that Victoria Police are particularly focused on, and I suspect that's the same in New South Wales, unless somebody somewhere does something stupid, which that's a guarantee as well. That will always happen as well. Okay, our next question. what are your hopes for the near future in this space? This is a good one to end on. Okay, this is our generic sort of ending question. But Symon, since you're on the screen, we'll start with you. Symon, what are you hoping to see over the next, let's say, 5 years?
From my perspective, in the mental health space, I would like to see more recognition of their potential use as a wellness enhancer and illness preventer, rather than waiting until using it at the very end of a treatment cascade. I'd like to see them become more accessible in the clinical space, price and availability wise. And I think I'd really like to see some legal change that recognises realistic relative harms and the fact that the current drug legislation causes, in my opinion, a lot more harm than it solves. In fact, I think it only really serves to cause extra harm.
Yeah, no, that's objective, I think.
Yeah. So to me, those are the main things. Yeah.